My privilege to introduce our next speaker. Stuart Hart is the S.C. Johnson Chair of Sustainable Global Enterprise and Professor of Management at the Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell, where he's founded the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. Prior to Cornell, he taught strategic management and sustainability at North Carolina and University of Michigan. We know Stuart is one of the top authorities on the implications of the environment and poverty for business strategy. Professor Hart has published more than 70 papers and authored or edited 7 books. He's wrote the highly influential article, Beyond Greening, Strategies for the Sustainable World, won the McKinsey Award for Best Article in the Harvard Business Review in 1997, co-wrote the groundbreaking 2002 article, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, really the person who popularized this bottom of the pyramid concept. And finally, Dr. Hart's best-selling book, Capitalism at the Crossroads, selected by Cambridge University as one of the top 50 books on sustainability of all time. I don't know a top list where Stuart Hart isn't part. Please join me in welcoming one of many of our heroes, Dr. Stuart Hart.
Ira, thanks so much. How you all doing? Hanging in there? All right, good, good. I'll try not to stand in your way too much here. What I'd like to do is maybe take a somewhat different perspective, develop a somewhat different perspective. That I guess if I would frame what I want to talk about, it would be the idea that conventional wisdom tells us that, especially with clean technologies that are new to the world, that they typically are more expensive to start. So we need to have an upmarket strategy, right? We need to focus on the high end, on the lead user. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, by the way. And if we look around, that's certainly a lot of companies and ventures appropriately follow that strategy. But what I'd like to do with you today is to kind of paradoxically argue exactly the opposite case. Not to claim that the upmarket strategy doesn't make any sense, because it does, but rather to say that I think there's another approach that's tremendously underleveraged and underutilized, which offers huge opportunity, and that's what I want to talk with you about. The idea that starting in the underserved space at the base of the income pyramid with next generation clean technology holds huge potential. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I want to talk with you about today. And I guess one of the reasons is that I believe, and again, just kind of truth in advertising, not just to shamelessly self-promote my book, but also to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from, that I think we're in one of those sort of pivot points in history and in time where everything changes, right? Where it doesn't happen overnight, but relatively speaking, within a decade or two, things shift in a dramatic way. I think we're maybe halfway into that. And when this book first came out, it came out in 2005. A number of people say, capitalism at the crossroads, isn't that a little over the top? Come on, capitalism rules. Just had the fall of communism. It's true, right? But I think now, especially, so the book's in its 3rd edition, I don't hear that comment quite so much anymore. I think everyone kind of deep down knows that something fundamental is going on out there and that we're in a transformational time. So I'm very interested in how do we develop strategies that can bring what comes next into the mainstream as quickly as possible. So that's really the spirit behind this, because like Tom Friedman, I really do think that we're at one of those points. Tom talks about it as the great disruption, the time when Mother Nature and Father Greed hit the wall at the same time. He has a great way of turning a phrase. And, maybe a way to visualize this is as the proverbial funnel that some of you have probably seen. That on one side of the funnel, we have kind of the increasing challenges around environment, right? Around depletion, degradation of natural capital and resources and pollution. We all know the story. I need not go into it any further, just to say that were we to bundle all of the Earth's natural systems that support everything we do into an ETF, we'd all be dumping the stock, right? That's the simple truth. And on the other side, of course, we have a whole set of challenges on the social side with population, poverty, growing inequity. We just crossed the 7 billion mark. We heard about that earlier this morning. In my lifetime, the human population has grown from 2 to 7, and You know, if I lived to be in a ripe old age, you know, I could see 8, 9 billion people on the planet, one lifetime. I mean, it's phenomenal when you think about this. So it shouldn't come as a huge surprise to us that some of the tried and true approaches to dealing with these emerging challenges just haven't worked so well. You know, we're sort of seeing things crashing into the sides of the funnel. You know, that just the kind of the regulatory mindset around environment and just conventional pollution control and, you know, even eco-efficiency, right, as great as it is, isn't getting it done, right? And that, you know, we think about aid and philanthropy, as important as they are, we're just not making the kind of headway on the issue of poverty and inequity that we'd like. So it's quite heartening, actually, that we see new approaches that could lead us through the neck of this funnel. And that, to me, that's the challenge of the next decade or two, is how do we invent these new enterprises that get us through the neck of the funnel? That's really the challenge of sustainable enterprise. And we have a couple of really important, exciting, you know, kind of optimistic emerging strategies for doing that. Of course, we're all here because we're interested in clean tech, right? I mean, there is a clean tech revolution going on. Again, we heard from Ira the numbers this morning, like, what is it, $1 trillion now that's been invested since '04. I mean, it's stunning, you know, and it's enormously exciting that we see this rapidly emerging new industry that, you know, should we be successful, can have a real impact on that side of the funnel, positive impact, right? We hope. And at the same time, we've seen emerge over the last decade or so this whole idea that business can play a role in addressing poverty, right? That it doesn't just have to be about aid and philanthropy and so forth. We've seen the rapid emergence of microenterprise, microfinance, you know, impact investing, you know, need I go on, right? There are lots of social entrepreneurship, lots of buzzwords, you know, around all this. And I think that's enormously exciting. I'll refer to that approach as base of the pyramid, or BOP, just for the sake of only using one moniker. So I think that we see the emergence of clean technology base of the pyramid very exciting, very important in terms of coming to grips with these challenges. But like with anything, whenever you solve a problem or you launch something new, there's an innovation that's come forward, you always solve some problems and create new ones. So it should come as no great surprise to us that as we've kind of come out of the gate over the last decade around clean tech and base of the pyramid, we're solving some problems, but we're creating new ones. And I think one of the important new problems, or really new opportunities, is to realize that these two domains have sort of evolved almost in isolation from one another. You know, it's like they're two communities, like C.P. Snow's classic book. And you think about it, here we have the group, the assembled group, that clean technology obviously has a very strong focus on technology, right? I mean, that's completely appropriate. That developing the world's next generation of clean technologies is really important, and that the environment is a big driving force, and that if we can just get these technologies developed and get their costs down, that somehow they will magically spring into, you know, mass commercialization. And, you know, the truth is, guys, come on, you know, it's just not happening as rapidly as we all would like, right? I mean, someday, maybe, right? But it's not happening as rapidly as we would like. And there's been a tendency in the clean tech space to focus, as I said before, more on the upmarket, right? Not so much on the rest of the world. Maybe emerging markets, but maybe the upmarket in emerging markets. But what about the 4 or 5 billion people, right, who have been fundamentally left out? And on the base of the pyramid side of this equation, you know, there's been a lot of focus on how do we change business models, right? How do we get extended distribution out into the slums and rural areas? How do we have more inclusive supply chains? How do we get costs down, right? It's really about addressing poverty, being more inclusive, business model innovation. Not so much about technology, right? And sometimes in this discussion about inclusive business or base of the pyramid, environment kind of gets lost, right? I mean, you often hear the idea that if we just can deal with the poverty problem, you know, then we can worry about environment. You know? And of course, we all know that if we do that, that could take us all over the cliff, right, environmentally. So as I see it, one of the big leverage points, one of the big challenges, one of the big opportunities that we have looking forward is how to bring these two worlds together. You know, I think of it as the convergence between clean technology and base of the pyramid. So for further buzzword proliferation, I'll call it the green leap, right? That bringing these two worlds together, converging clean technology and base of the pyramid, is an exciting new opportunity space that we may want to give more attention to. Kind of add to the portfolio, as it were, both for startups, but also for corporate entrepreneurship, and I'll talk more about that. Because I absolutely believe, and I have some empirical evidence to support this, that, in some ways, we're drowning in technology, right? I mean, yes, we need to keep R&D. Yes, there are challenges we have in, in power storage and a lot of other areas where we need to keep the work going. On the other hand, I come from Cornell University. I can tell you with some assurance that if you go to the Intellectual Property Office, now called the Center for Entrepreneurship and Technology Venturing, right, appropriately rebranded, that there are literally thousands of technologies sitting there on the shelf, right, that are doing nothing, right, and in corporations, many of them in the room here, hundreds and hundreds of shelf technologies. Now, a lot of it's junk, granted, right, but some of them are pretty interesting, right? And if you look at some of these technologies, not through the lens of licensing into an incumbent industry, that's why they're sitting there, right? But rather through the lens of, well, if they have certain features, like can they be implemented without external power, or are they renewable, or are they bio-based, or can they be implemented on a distributed basis, or are they small scale? A lot of these technologies have these characteristics, and they don't fit the existing incumbent business model, so they sit there, right? Well, what if we took those and repurposed them, kind of recast them, right, and really thought about this notion, how do we kind of water them from the bottom up, right, and think about base of the pyramid as a new opportunity space? What might that look like, and could it, in fact, lead us through the neck of this funnel? Or could it be an important way, right, to lead us through the neck of this funnel? Because by my way of thinking, we need to get these next generation technologies mainstreamed, right? They need to become mass market as rapidly as we can possibly make that happen. Both because there's a huge business opportunity, but we also need that for the world, right? I mean, I think it's just crucially important to think about it in those terms. So one of the things I've been involved with doing is trying to kind of foment this notion of green leap. And we convened something a couple of years, now 3-4 years back, called the Cornell Global Forum on Sustainable Enterprise, where we brought about 100 intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs from around the world together, all interested in this idea of converging clean technology and base of the pyramid to meet. We had a closing session that was in New York, the 92nd Street Y. You probably recognize some of these characters, that over on the far left is Charlie Rose. He kind of emceed the thing. Then, of course, the least important guy. And then you had Gore, and you got Fish Johnson, who's the chairman and CEO of SE Johnson. You know who the guy in the far right is? Recognize him? That's Ratan Tata, yeah, the soon-to-retire chairman of the Tata Group in India. And the whole focus was to talk about this idea as is this a viable innovation and business strategy to kind of move us ahead? And one of the things I think that's important, kind of as we double-click on this notion, is to maybe draw some distinction about clean technology, right? I think there are probably several important separations to be made or distinctions to be made around the whole notion of clean technology. One, of course, is there's an important distinction between eco-efficiency clean technology, in other words, making existing products and processes less impactful, from next generation or leapfrog or disruptive, kind of entirely new to the world. That's distinction number one. Right? I'm talking about the latter. Right? But then within that category, I think it's important to separate out what I would think of as kind of green giant technologies. These would be inherently large-scale centralized applications that require a big capital investment of some kind, and have a big footprint typically. These would be solar farms, kind of big wind farms, any of these kind of projects, nuclear, clean coal, and some of us in the room might dispute whether or not these belong on the list, but that's a separate discussion. The point is that they're large-scale, centralized, kinds of applications that are going to take pipes and wires and other kinds of things in order to make them work. And these, not surprisingly, have gotten a fair amount of traction, especially in the developed world, because they fit institutionally with what we've already got in place. That shouldn't come as a huge surprise to any of us. But that then leaves, this other category, which, I'll refer to as green sprout, which are those kind of technologies and applications that are more decentralized, distributed, on-site, point of use, small scale, can be organized from the bottom up, right? You can try it on a small experimental basis before making massive investment. You can, get the bugs out before you make huge mistakes, all that kind of stuff. And these, of course, are, examples are things like distributed generation, decentralized solar, blah, 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 right? I mean, there's whole bunches of these. And these, unsurprisingly, have, in my view, struggled more, right? Especially in the existing top of the pyramid markets, because they tend to be disruptive, right? In a Clayton Christensen sense of the term, they tend to be disruptive. So they've had a hard time. I mean, it's tough sledding. They're up against the power of incumbency, and they're up against perverse incentives and so forth. We all know why it's sometimes difficult for these things to come forward. But I'll argue that as important as the green giant stuff is, that's sort of consistent with the industrial mainframe world, right? Whereas the green sprout stuff, I think, is where we're going, right? I mean, it's sort of more consistent with the internet handheld world, right? And everything that goes along with that. So I want to argue that it makes sense for us to think much more creatively about how do we commercialize these technologies over on the right-hand side, because, boy, they're coming on like gangbusters, right? I'll just flash up a few of what these technologies are. I mean, we could keep building the list out. It's not just energy, right? It crosses all sectors, and it includes health, right? I mean, the whole idea of point of care or self-care, and GE, we have GE in the room, of course, they got a lot of press for the innovations that have come from the bottom up in India and so forth with, handheld ultrasound and so forth. So there are all kinds of these enabling technologies that are, that have emerged over the last decade or two and will continue to, that have this kind of character that I'm describing, this sort of small-scale distributed point of use kind of characteristic. The problem, as I look at it, is that for many of the entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, the tendency has been to continue to try to commercialize these things from the top down, right? Exclusively. And when you do that, if we think about distributed solar or electric vehicles, what you get is sort of by definition, at least to start, a premium priced, kind of niche market, limited scaling strategy, right? Because there's no other choice, right? That's the way it has to go, at least to begin with, until you can begin to get costs down, get enough volume so you get costs down and so forth. The problem, of course, is that what you end up with, at least in the near term, is very limited. Once you get down below a certain income level, there's a hard stopping point. You just don't get any further penetration until you can really begin to get the cost down. But what if we took that kind of that mindset and turned it upside down? So this is the idea of the green leap. That what if we began with the premise that we should turn our mentality upside down and look at the underserved space at the base of the pyramid, where, again, it's been noted there are 1 billion plus people without access to dependable electricity, drinking water, and so forth. We don't need to cover what the needs are. I think everyone in the room knows that the needs are great. That's not in dispute. The question becomes, are there ways to actually address this on a commercial basis? And is it possible to think about some of these technologies, the highest technologies, incubating first in the underserved space? Precisely because you don't have a fully built-out infrastructure already, precisely because you don't have the incumbents that have positions to protect, and precisely because you're free to experiment, much more easily. There's a whole lot more room for flexibility. And so if we think of I just kind of pull a couple of companies, Chinese companies, out as examples, and I'll focus on one in the distributed solar space that ended up kind of employing this kind of strategy where, you try it for a while at the top, it doesn't work so well, then of necessity, you kind of leap to the base, find people in the case of Huamin Solar, more out in the towns and the rural areas that are underserved, and build a business model for vacuum tube solar around those that were underserved, have been able to now build a business around that, and now it's beginning to trickle up, right? So this is also the logic around not only, leaping down, lifting the base of the pyramid, creating employment, and incubating next generation technology, but also the possibility of trickle up, or what's being called reverse innovation, that maybe some of these things, as we build them out and create more sustainable ways of living at the base of the pyramid, they can trickle their way back up here, right? Eventually they come back up here. So for those of you that have spent any time outside of the major cities in China, you've probably seen these things everywhere, right? Am I right? People know this, right? You see them everywhere. So, I mean, this is basically glass vacuum tube solar hot water. I mean, it's very, you could say it's low tech. It's very sustainable. I mean, there's no precious metals, there's no antifreeze, there's no toxics. This is basically highly engineered glass vacuum tubes that collect the sun's energy and heat the water. I mean, it's very simple, less than half the cost of flat panel solar, very durable, very dependable, and this is scaling out like crazy, starting in the underserved towns and small, sort of towns and small cities in more rural China. Huamin Solar tried to ram it into Shanghai and Beijing. It just didn't work. Most people, again, just assumed that if it was some green thing, it was probably going to cost them more, right? I mean, people are sort of programmed to think that way, right? And so they shut it down. But by taking the leap, they got into a completely new space. We're able to build a business model around it that worked, that employed people and built their capacity. And this industry, just in China alone, now is about to cross the $10 billion mark, right? And some of you might be familiar with it. It's only a matter of time before this industry scales out laterally to other parts of the developing world. It's already starting to. And then eventually begins to trickle up, kind of the reverse innovation engine. And there are more and more of these kind of players out there. So I'm doing a bunch of work in India. If I have time, I'll mention a couple of things about it. But just to flash some of those players that some of you might be familiar with. And of course, it's not just entrepreneurs, that's also entrepreneurs. I mentioned Rod and Tata earlier, but a lot of you are probably familiar with what the Tata Group is up to. I mean, it has probably no fewer than a dozen significant business initiatives that are focused on bringing next generation technology into products and services starting in the underserved space. Right? Tata Nano gets all the attention, but there are many, many others in the water space, in low-cost housing, you name it. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting innovation that's beginning to happen. Ratan Tata calls it frugal innovation, right? That's another buzzword that's come out. So what's the strategic logic for this whole approach? If we have a world pyramid that looks like this with about 1 billion rich people like us, right, and an emerging flat world middle class of maybe 1.5 billion or so, and then a base of the pyramid of 4.5. Well, most of us and most companies traditionally focused on the top because that's where the money is, right? Some have begun to focus on the middle as the emerging market because that's the rising middle class. But the base has still received comparatively less attention, although I'm arguing there's huge potential there. Why? As we've said, this is a huge new potential market, but it's going to require us to behave a little differently because we actually have to create a market, not enter an existing one. That's an important distinction. It's kind of the work that I've done with Prahalad over the years. He passed away last year, as many of you know, has tried to establish that case. Two, that it's a way to think about incubating next generation clean technology, leapfrog technology, in a classically Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation way of thinking. This kind of leap down, find the underserved, poorly served space, and then trickle it up, as I've just discussed. And third, there's a huge competitive preemption aspect here. In other words, I mentioned Ratan Tata, but I could have pointed out dozens of other developing country corporations, entrepreneurial companies and corporations that have plays in this space, and they're going after it pretty aggressively. So I think, US-based, European, Japanese multinationals and entrepreneurs that ignore this probably do so at their peril, right? There's a pretty strong competitive preemption argument here. Now, if that's the strategic justification for it, let me spend just a few minutes on what some of the challenges of doing this are, and I've got about 8 minutes, so I'll stay on schedule. A lot of times the assumption is, as I said before, that, wow, we have all these huge needs, right, at the base of the pyramid. There's 4.5 billion people. We know what, we've got stacks of UN reports, about nutrition and sanitation and potable water and blah, blah. We don't need any more data to convince us, right? So I think for some, the assumption is, wow, there's this huge market. Let's just go after it. The BOP is an untapped market. Let's go get it, right? Well, it hasn't really worked out that way, and that probably shouldn't come as a great surprise to us that it's not that simple, right? That just because there are needs, that's not the same thing as market demand, right? And just because you're able to kind of strip cost out of something doesn't mean people are going to buy it. But I think that a lot of the early attempts to do this have kind of been guilty of both of those assumptions, right? And they've not worked so well. You know, we've ended up with kind of a lot of living dead BOP enterprises and companies over the last 10 years that have made that, you know, I think that was their embedded assumptions were that. Instead, I think it's important for us to note that when it comes to the top of the pyramid, what, you know, most of us are accustomed to, that's really about creating needs in existing markets, right? And we, as business people, we know how to do that pretty well. Whereas the base of the pyramid is fundamentally about creating entirely new markets out of existing needs. A completely different challenge that takes a different set of skills. So I think if we're going to get serious about this, we have to gear ourselves up, you know, to actually take this challenge on. It's a learnable set of skills, and I'll talk about it in a moment. You know, and kind of early in the game of trying to figure this, and not that I figured it out, but, you know, at least beginning to try to wrestle with why is it that some things work and some don't, you know, I was sort of struck by some of the BOP initiatives, technologies, products, services that have really taken off, right? And here's three of them, right, which on the far left is treadle pumps, you know, which have absolutely taken off in Africa, like virally, right? In the middle, you recognize that guy, right? Mohammed Yunus. Right? So the microfinance industry, you know, has also, over the last 10, 15 years, taken off. And on the far right, of course, is rural telephony, right, the mobile phone industry, which has just gone through the roof, right, in the last 10 years. You think about it, it's now almost 4 billion users, right? It's just incredible what's happened. A lot of it driven by BOP business models, right, to get shared service out into rural villages and so forth. And so I asked myself, well, why have these taken off when a lot of other attempts to sell water filters, you know, and all this kind of like marketing cheap products to the poor just have fallen flat? And I guess one of the conclusions I come to is actually contained, you know, you recognize this guy? Like, you know, you give it away with the Unfinished Symphony, right? It's a Schubert, who composer of the Unfinished Symphony. Little did he know when he composed it, you know, in 1822, that he was holding the key to success in the BOP marketplace. But I think it has everything to do with the idea that we can't, as entrepreneurs and technologists, go in with all the answers, right? And our tendency is to want to really over-determine the offering, you know, to have it all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed right down to the final note of the symphony, and then come in and here's the offering, here's what its functionality is, here's the price point, we've done the marketing research, buy it, right? That's our natural instinct. When it comes to base of the pyramid, it turns out that that doesn't seem to work very well. Usually because there's hubris involved, that we can't possibly understand that context because we're not embedded in it, right? So a big part of this is about becoming embedded. And writing some of the symphony, right? We have to write enough so that people can develop an idea of what a technology is capable of, but leaving it open, you know, so that people in the community itself play a role in helping to co-create the very concept of the business itself, right? In other words, it's an embedding and co-creation process. These technologies had them, that's what they're basically enabling platforms. So by definition, that's what they are, right? I mean, people don't want to have a microfinance loan as a product. They get the loan to do something with it, right? It's by definition an enabling platform. But as technologists and product developers, we can take that learning or that insight and embed it in the kind of business development processes that we use to bring clean technology into underserved space. You see what I mean? It's a different way of thinking about business development. So we have this other book that just came out where we try to get after this in a pretty substantial way. You know, and the distinction is the original piece that CK and I did was called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and then CK had a book by that title. That's raised a lot of, you know, as I said before, you solve problems, you create new ones. Probably the biggest new problem created by that title is the image that it conveys, that there's a bag of money down there, you know, in the rural villages and slums, let's go get it, right? Let's just go get the fortune. That's not the way it works, right? That this is really about creating a fortune with those in the base of the pyramid. And there are a whole set of tools and approaches for trying to do that, right? That to do Green Leap and do it well means, you know, not just sort of getting, you know, the things in affordable sachet packages and so forth, getting price down. It may not even require, you know, the killer app, as it were, although that doesn't hurt. It's really a business process and business development challenge. It's the ability to engage with people in these communities, in a partnership to build a trust relationship. And then most importantly, once that's done, to creatively marry the knowledge and skills and capabilities and aspirations of people in the community, marry those with what the company brings, the technology that the company brings, to create a business concept that neither could have on their own. That's really what the Huamin people did so successfully with the vacuum tube that I mentioned earlier. And almost all the cases that we've been able to find that succeed seem to follow this kind of pattern. And then, you know, they kind of evolve and scale from the ground up. So this was a recent example of this that some of you may have seen, called the Chodacool. Is this familiar? This was Godrej in India. You know, about 4 years ago, they were intent on developing a refrigerator for the poor. And, you know, as you might expect, they went in, did all the market research, understood what the household expenditure patterns were, knew what the price point had to be, tasked the R&D people and the product developers with coming up with a refrigerator that hit all those requirements, which they did, right? They worked with NGOs, they went out, they repurposed some of their direct sales people to go out into the villages and start selling these things. They were convinced that it was going to be a home run. It fell flat. Right? They took a step back, they said, okay, obviously we got something wrong here, decided to start over again completely, and engaged with a group of IDEO-style designers, which some of you might be familiar with, that are participatory design people, spent time in the communities themselves, involved the women in particular in the actual development of this, and learned a lot in the process about that it should not be a refrigerator at all. It's really a new category completely, right, called the Chodacool. No freezer. Freezer's irrelevant. You know, that what you need is something that can double as a work surface. You can move it around. That's easy to repair. So the cooling unit is in the top. You can pop the top off. It can be run off of a battery. It can be recharged. The original refrigerator required power, right, which made absolutely no sense at all in this context. So long story short, they built a whole new concept, a new category with a completely new business model around it, where the women themselves are part of it, and it's building their livelihood to sell and service it. And this is beginning to get some very substantial traction, and it's driven technology innovation in the company too, right? It's allowed them to take some green technologies that previously they hadn't been able to figure out what to do with and embed them in this device. So just to close, I mentioned before that I'm involved in trying to make this stuff happen out there on the ground, and I'm involved in a new institute that we're creating in India for the moment called the Indian Institute for Sustainable Enterprise. You know, if you're interested, you can go to the site. There's kind of a crude one there to start with. But what we're out to do is, you know, nothing short of trying to invent and implement a new model of business and entrepreneurial education and training to meet the challenges that I've just talked about. You know, that, in other words, to start fresh, to be a disruptor, to practice what we preach, and to increase the number and success rate of these kinds of new ventures and entrepreneurial initiatives within corporations. That's what the entire institute is geared around. What we're trying to do is to build kind of an integrated model, an ecosystem, so it's not just about education and capability building. That's part of it. There's certainly that. But we'll also be looking to create a new fund that'll be focused specifically on this notion of Green Leap, and it'll put together basically a portfolio to fund only these kinds of ventures. There'll be an incubator. There'll be sets of partners and ecosystems around the problems that we've talked about. We call them cluster labs. And then we'll look to source in technology from universities and corporations, shelf technology, into a technology, clean tech patent bank. Right? A lot of us, I think, have been focused on finding the opportunities where in places we know well, where the light is. Right? When in fact, increasingly, maybe we need to be looking in the dark places. Right? That's where we're going to really uncover possibly some things that could take us into entirely new territory. And in order to do that, one, you know, it's a little bit of a leap of faith, and two, it's going to require some courage and the development of some new skills and capabilities to make it happen. But hopefully I've at least stimulated your interest in this one. If you want to talk more about it, I'll be around the rest of the day and part of tomorrow, so thank you all very much.